And, the Cmax was a peptide which was derived from ACTH. They saw that ACTH had some effects on learning and behavior, and then they isolated those effects to the peptide sequence, and then they designed a peptide sequence which would be more bioavailable and last longer in the blood. And so that's sort of how it happens is, again, you identify the natural functioning of a particular segment or peptide, and then you perform experiments to make sure that you can maximize those changes due to the peptide sequence.
Welcome to the podcast for Healing Neurology, where we talk about everything that can help heal your neurology, which is really everything from food, lifestyle, and medicine to nature, culture, and politics. There's no topic too big or too small. I'm Jillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine. And today we have with us the illustrious Ryan Smith from Tailor Made Compounding. He is a biochemist with a background in peptide and protein synthesis. He is not a medical doctor, but he did complete the USMLE Step 1 training and actually left medical school in order to help found Tailor Made Compounding Pharmacy in February of 2016. Tailor Made has made international history in the development and science behind peptide pharmaceuticals and is now one of the fastest growing companies in the US. It's the fourth fastest growing company in healthcare, entirely because peptides are exploding. And we know that this is going to be our next wave of kind of pharmaceutical development. He is blessed with a close proximity to innovative doctors and clinicians and clearly loves what he does and is obviously obsessed with peptides. So we are so lucky to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's just jump in. What the heck is a peptide? I know, so peptide technically is a string of protein. What is a peptide here?
Yeah, absolutely. So peptides are just, I always like to say they're just a type of drug molecule. It always goes back to the central dogma of biochemistry in terms of how your body creates, its infrastructure and talks within itself. And the way that it does that is by taking DNA to RNA and RNA to peptides. So peptides are just amino acid building blocks, usually defined as less than 50 or 75 amino acids. They can be done synthetically and administered to the body like we're doing as nasal sprays, oral products, or injections in order to mimic that body's natural biochemistry and signaling. And so they're just very, very biosimilar signaling molecules.
Would you call them bioidentical?
Yeah, in some cases, definitely. A lot of the products we might even talk about today are the exact same sequence of what we would find in the body. But however, others might differ from, one amino acid or have a different type of backbone or isomer structure. So there are definitely several that are bioidentical, but I would say probably the majority are actually going to be biosimilar.
Biosimilar. And can you tell me a little bit about what biosimilar means?
Yeah, so a lot of these products that are taking their inspiration from the body's natural production and biochemistry. And so what happens is if we see something that's being made, but we can tweak it just a little bit to make it last a little bit longer or to be a little bit more specific, then it can become a really promising drug candidate. We do that often, and a lot of those products are going to mimic something that is very, very similar to what your body produces naturally.
Got it. And my understanding is that sometimes these amino acids or the peptides that we're using are kind of fragments of what the whole peptide might be in the body or what the whole protein structure might be. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. Fragments are a big portion of that. And it's still very, very common. A lot of times receptors for these peptides don't need stimulation from the entire protein, but just a little piece. And so, yeah, that's definitely a common strategy as well.
How long have we been thinking about peptides?
Yeah, a long time. Secretin in the early 1900s, was one of the first peptides that was sort of discovered. But, we didn't start to use endogenous peptides for a long time. And what typically happened then is it would be purified from other tissue, whether it be animal tissue where they would take insulin or they would take growth hormone from human cadaver pituitaries or something like that. In terms of synthetic made peptides, that's a relatively, recent process, even just within a lot happening within the past 50 years. And so it's still a very, very new process, which is which is still growing and expanding, which is why you're seeing such the explosion now, is because a lot of the methods for making things that are very, very similar or figuring out which products are going to be the best are now really gaining momentum. And it's a very, very new process, but one that, is, like I said, mimics your natural biochemistry. So, things like insulin and oxytocin have been used since the 60s. And so it's a very, very common thing.
How many peptides are out there?
More than I can even count. It's expanding rapidly, but whenever you have over now 20 amino acid, natural and your non-natural amino acids, along with a bunch of other modifications which can be made, L-isomers, different types of additions or subtractions from synthetic molecules, there are a countless number. And really, it's hard to even say. At one point around 4 years ago, there were over 7,000 in development. I would say that that's now at least doubled or tripled.
Wow.
And so it's an absolutely limitless field due to all the different combinations we can have.
Who is developing these?
Yeah, everyone. A lot of the basic biochemistry was done in university settings. And so a lot of the papers you'll see will be done there. Big pharmaceutical companies, though, are definitely realizing this is a potential therapy as well and seriously investing a lot of resources into this. There are a couple really good papers published out there with great data on the cumulative approvals of peptides where, it's just exponentially growing. Almost everyone has some skin in the game, I would say, at this point, and everyone's investigating it for that next big breakthrough in medicine.
In 2015, there were 68 that were approved. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And how many are approved now?
To be honest, I don't even know the correct number, but easily I would say over 100. So even in just that short amount of time, it's over doubled. It's still an explosion and it's hard to keep up with.
Yeah. How many does Tailor Made offer?
A lot. We do probably over 50 unique peptide products. And we do everything from commercial products like variations of liraglutide or Thymosin Alpha-1 for people who are unable to tolerate the commercial. But we also do some more unique ones that are in phase 1 and phase 2 clinical development and research trials and other things of that nature.
What does the approval process look like? Or what, if we say a peptide's approved, what are we talking about?
Peptide approval is all about FDA approval, which means that a product or a drug is approved for a certain indication. People might be familiar with off-label prescribing where a product is used for an indication in which it's not approved. That there are a lot of examples of that. The peptides, though, there's a lot just due to how many are currently being researched. There's a lot which are somewhere between phase 1 in phase 3 clinical trials where they have safety data, where they have really basic fundamental data, but they don't have approval for a particular indication. That is sort of where we're at with some of these products.
How do you design a peptide?
Most of the design, there are a couple of these neuropeptides, which are actually really good examples for exactly how this process happens. I think we'll talk about the Selank and the Semax probably at least at one point today. The Semax was a peptide which was derived from ACTH. They saw that ACTH had some effects on learning and behavior, and then they isolated those effects to the peptide sequence, and then they designed a peptide sequence which would be more bioavailable and last longer in the blood. And so that's sort of how it happens. Is again, you identify the natural functioning of a particular segment or peptide, and then you perform experiments to make sure that you can maximize those changes due to the peptide sequence. And so that's a really good example. Same with the Selank, which was actually made from tufsin, which is an immune molecule. And they said, hey, we're seeing immune benefit from these. How can we change this to make it more immune stimulatory and again, stay around longer in the serum? Both of those are really good examples of how that process typically occurs.
Semax and Selank, why don't we just dive into them a little bit, because they are some of the neuropeptides that we use a lot here. They can be used as nasal sprays. And Can you tell us a little bit about what their target is and especially how they work together?
Yeah, definitely. So the Selank and Semax are both Russian-derived peptides, and a lot of the research has been done in Russia. Some really, really good results. These Russian institutes did exactly what we talked about. They found the endogenous peptides, which had some effect, and then tried to isolate those effects with specific amino acid sequences. And so the Selank and Semax were, Selank derived from the immune portion, Semax derived from ACTH and learning and behavior, really have those effects. The Selank is immunostimulatory, can help reduce viral loads. And, there's even a great study which shows that in influenza, it can reduce essentially flu titers to 0 within 2 days of administration. So that's pretty amazing. And then the Semax, has been studied for the learning and behavior benefits. So it can help with focus, help with learning, can reduce stress. And in addition to that, both of them have other benefits as well. With the Selank, as a nasal spray. They also have shown that it can be potentially very, very anxiolytic and reduce anxiety, as well as, reduce pain. Same with Cmax, which can reduce pain through its behavior at reducing the degradation of endogenous enkephalins. And so they have a lot of other benefits, which make them really synergistic with each other as well. And so because they're both nasal sprays, and actually one of the very few peptides which actually work better as a nasal than a subcutaneous injectable, they're often used together for a variety of mental benefits, reducing inflammation, helping with metabolic disease, and then obviously the learning and the anti-anxiety benefits, which are probably their predominant use.
What would a typical dosage look like?
Yeah, so most of the studies have really started at a dose around 750 micrograms, so very, very low dosing. And some people might do that once or twice a day. Its duration of action is actually pretty short, anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. And so a lot of people like repeated administrations. And really, there doesn't seem to be a ton of negative side effects associated with these. No toxicity. Really, the major side effects tend to be, headache or nausea, or things that are very similar to placebo.
How long would a person take this for?
Again, that really, and it brings up a good point, is that we always recommend, there's probably a lot of these things you can find online, but how reputable they are, it still leaves a lot to be questioned. So we always urge people to go to their practitioners to help them establish a protocol and plan which is most advantageous for them. But usually courses for this can last anywhere from 20 days to even 2 years on an as needed basis. For instance, if it's anxiety that's provoked from, flying, for instance, taking it before a flight might be something, or a test might be something that someone can use. So it really depends on everyone's situation. But for this one, the course isn't as important because there's really no resistance built up to these peptides. And they don't seem to have a ton of negative side effects. And so in the clinical literature, they've been described from anywhere from 20 days to 3 years.
Let's dive in a little bit to side effects, because that's something that is one of the big benefits of peptides, is they don't seem to have them. Why is that?
Yeah, so the main reason is because they're mimicking a lot of your body's natural signaling, and say they're very, very specific for what they're meant to do. Usually they don't have actions at a lot of different sites in the body. A lot of times it's degraded by peptidases in the blood rather than your kidneys or your livers. They don't have drug-to-drug interactions. And so their specificity and lack of drug-to-drug interactions are huge, huge benefits, and why peptides generally as a class have much fewer side effects than some of these synthetic molecules, which are hard to get rid of out of your body, and have more, I would say, broad spectrum action, which is not always a good thing.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the tricks, is being able to find something that acts in a targeted manner. So are you saying that these totally bypass the CYP450 enzyme system? Is that right?
Not always. There are always exceptions to the rule. And so, there are definitely some things which might interfere, but the majority of them are going to be very, very predictable in metabolism outside of the liver and kidneys.
Are there ways to check their metabolites, or do they make metabolites?
So the metabolites are usually peptide fragments of the original chain, which don't have a lot of biological activity, I would say, most of the time. And so there are definitely, almost all of these have published metabolite data, but usually it's going to be relatively irrelevant just because they don't have biological activity. And they're broken down to the amino acids that you might have after a protein meal, for instance.
Okay, got it. Right, exactly. So then here's another question, which I kind of already know the answer to, but I want our listeners to hear, is that what is the role of a gut in peptide absorption? So for instance, the question I'm really getting at is, what if we have got leaky gut or inflammation in the gut, which is so common these days? How do we get our peptides? Yeah,
definitely. So there are always exceptions to the rule. And that's one thing I want to point out, is that just due to the breadth of what peptides can be, there are always exceptions. And so I always point out that the majority of peptides are actually going to be degraded way before you actually get to the gut or the intestine. So a lot of these are broken up by amylase, in the saliva or in the stomach acid. And at that point, they're fragmented, and so they don't reach the intestines as a typical peptide would. There are always exceptions to the rules, however, and there are a couple which are able to get to that intestinal mucosa and have some effects on inflammation, or be able to cross those gap junctions in your intestinal cells. And so as a result, there are definitely certain peptides which work on the gut, but there are a lot of things which would never even get there. I would say the majority would not be orally bioavailable, which is actually one of the biggest weaknesses of peptides, and one of the reasons that they haven't been as thoroughly investigated as small drug molecules like, you might see with antibiotics or Cialis or Viagra, because those things are a lot easier to take. And as a result, drug companies say, hey, if we can reach a wider audience, let's focus on those.
What are some of the peptides that are good to take orally?
Again, they're very, very few, unfortunately. But one of the big ones is the BPC-157. That's one that has good data in multiple dosage forms, peritoneally, orally and injection. But it's one of the very, very few which has an effect on the gut and bypasses a lot of that degradation you would see in the saliva or the stomach acid. So that's one of the very, very few. Other peptides now have different ways of getting to the intestine. So a lot of things now are done via enteric coated capsules, which is a nice way of saying basically is whenever it gets to your stomach acid, that the acidity of the stomach actually protects the capsule, the casing around these peptides. But whenever it gets to the more basic environment of your intestines, that capsule can break down and release it directly in the intestines. And so that's why another reason I say it's all peptide specific is because it's not just peptide specific, it's formulation specific. And so there are a couple of peptides now which are really exciting for things like leaky gut called liraglutide, which is one of the peptides we'll be offering as an enteric coated capsule, which is also going to be great for oral bioavailability. So while there are a few, the breakthroughs are continuing to happen. You're going to see this more and more and more.
How do you usually get your peptides? We've talked about the Cmax and Selank, which is nasal spray, BPC-157, which can be oral, and also Sub-Q. We use it for both here. There's Sub-Q, meaning subcutaneous. So how do most people get most peptides?
Yeah, most injections, most are going to be via injection via the subcutaneous route. So injections right into the fat. For those who are listening who probably have never had a subcutaneous injection, I always like to say it's not like a vaccine injection that's IM going into your shoulder. These needles are diabetic insulin needles. They're very, very small, almost imperceptible in use. And so what you're doing is you're depositing that container of solution into the fat tissue, which has a lot of blood vessels and can distribute that all over the body with some really reliable pharmacokinetics. And so subcutaneous injections are really the preferred method because you don't have to worry about how much is getting degraded. You don't have to worry about how much, actually hitting the system. You can really be predictable. And it's by far the most common method of administration.
Actually, I just had a beloved patient, and after her first injection, she looked up and said, "That's it?" And I said, "Yep, that's it."
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very common response for most of our patients, I would say. And so really, if you can get over that whole hurdle, a lot more options become available and you're able to really find an appropriate treatment strategy.
And so let's talk a little bit about also toxicity. We talked about side effects. Why can't these get toxic? It seems like insulin is one example of a peptide we have been using for decades and decades and are well familiar with at all kind of ranges of the medical spectrum. And certainly too much insulin can be fatal. So why can't these other peptides get toxic?
Yeah. And again, the majority of these things are based off of your natural body functioning molecules. And so by taking advantage of that natural pathways, we can really be specific. The other thing is that while insulin is an endocrine, product, something that affects almost every cell in the body, a lot of these peptides are very, very specific for certain cells and certain receptors, which means that they have limited capacity to go above and beyond to cause any damage. One of the ways that this happens is via saturation. For a lot of these peptides, they're hitting saturation doses of the body for their receptor we're targeting, meaning that going above and beyond doesn't actually cause any more of an effect. And your body can also, like I said, degrade these things relatively quickly, which is a weakness and a benefit of peptides. One of the big things is, if you want a particular reaction, sometimes you want it for a long period of time. Sometimes you want it for a short period of time. The peptides, especially without them modified, you get really short reactions, almost like having a baby, which has this one specific instance, which causes a bunch of downstream results. And so these things are very, very short acting, but specific. And so that usually limits, I would say, their profiles for toxicity versus a lot of other products. But with that being said, again, every product should be considered entirely specific, which is why these things can get so complicated and why they need to be regulated by a physician or a medical practitioner, because someone needs to be trained on all the things that are specific to that particular peptide, and which can be very different for even products which are very, very similar.
One of the other things that we've talked about over time is that they're really synergistic. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. And there can be a lot of peptides would work on the same pathway at different levels in the pathway. And so a lot of these things are great to combine with one another. We mentioned the Selank and the Semax. A lot of their effects can happen via nootropic signaling or neurotropic signaling, where they're increasing things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So whenever you hit the multiple pathways, can have synergistic effects. And so another one we always frequently talk about are the combinations of growth hormone releasing products, which if you hit multiple receptors, you can have added benefit. And so, yeah, definitely a lot of these are synergistic in effect.
So here at the Center for Healing Neurology, we do end up having a lot of protocols. So kind of how to combine these things. That's kind of the mix and match fun of this stuff.
Definitely. And most people will have, I would say, a lot of protocols to address, a particular thing because, your body has so many different pathways to regulate. And by maximizing the function of all of these pathways, you can get the best clinical result.
And it's very typical actually in Ayurveda. So my background's in Ayurveda, and more than one kind of silver bullet medication or pharmaceutical or herbal product, really they've always worked in synergistic combinations because two small ones often will have a lower toxicity profile and a better synergistic activity efficiency than one herb given in higher doses.
Absolutely.
This seems right along that biological continuum.
Definitely, and very much along that natural pathway as well, where you're getting as close to the body's natural processes and function as you can.
What are they made out of? Protein as a structure. How do they get sourced?
So there are two different ways to make peptides. One is a way that is not commonly used anymore, except for really, really big products, which is called recombinant, essentially protein synthesis. And that is where you essentially introduce the DNA for these peptides and proteins into things like bacteria. So you put the DNA into this bacteria, then you tell the bacteria to proliferate and produce this product. So you have huge vats of things like E. coli, which are not dangerous. They're just producing a lot of these proteins and peptides. And for really big, long, complicated structures of amino acids, this can be a lot easier to do than to do it synthetically. Almost everything that's used, though clinically nowadays, is essentially synthetic. It's all done via solid phase peptide synthesis, which is where you put essentially amino acids together piece by piece by piece. And these amino acids are a little bit, they're not, the amino acids you would get in your pre-workout powders or your proteins. They're protected amino acids. And by being protected, they're only able to add to one end of the amino acid. And so you're able to really specifically create these peptide chains exactly how you would want them. And then obviously one of the biggest steps is purification to make sure that you're getting exactly what you want at a very, very high level, because, things that might differ from one amino acid can have a drastic difference in the body. And so purity and making sure you've sourced the correct peptide is hugely, hugely important.
I've seen pictures of I think one of the machines that you have, it looks like a big gumball machine where you can kind of
Absolutely. Yeah. What I always tell people is it's just a really expensive pump. What it does is it makes sure that all the reagents are added in the specific order at the specific time, at the specific concentration, to make sure that whenever we're creating these chains of peptides, that each of the chains is the appropriate amino acid at the right point. And then even more important than that is the purification methods, where we make sure that at the very end of it, we're over 99.8% purity for whatever we're saying it is. If it's a 15 amino acid structure, we know that those 15 amino acids are perfectly in the same sequence as we would want them to make sure that they are the best medicine for our patients.
Really specific recipes. And that speaks to the questions about cheaper peptides out there that are popping up all over. And in fact, I've had some patients bring to me, I tried this one, but it was expensive, so I've done this cheaper one. What are those people doing?
Yeah, my number one thought at the end of the day is it's not worth it. The products which are available on that sort of non-prescription market, the number one thing about it is they're not regulated. No one is checking to make sure that they're doing what they're saying they're doing. And a lot of these products come with things like not for human use or for research use only. And again, no one is checking their work, which is really scary. If you get them wrong, can have a lot of different effects. As I mentioned, even opposite effects, things that are very, very similar can actually work on the same receptor, but not cause the same stimulation. They might just block the receptor. So they might have the exact opposite effect of what you want. Not to mention they could be dangerous with contaminants. I always point to a New York Times article because a lot of people think, hey, from a commercial source, you might just be trying to, basically reduce the competition by saying these things. But I always like to say we're regulated by the FDA. And if you want a really good third-party resource on some of these things, there was a New York Times article that was written called The Vast Heart of a Doping Conspiracy by Michael Powell, which listed a Swiss anti-doping association source where they do testing on all these things and find that over 80% are fraudulent or fake. I think that that's a really good objective source to know that, hey, you definitely want this to be managed by a physician who knows what they're doing, and you want to make sure that it's the correct product. Otherwise, you could have some really disastrous consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And why are they so expensive at this point? They are expensive. Peptides are not pennies to the dose. And what do you see as happening with cost in the future?
Definitely going down. The price will always go down as usage increases. Economies of scale are important for everything, in the world because you can reduce a lot of that overhead cost. But right now, there's a lot of money spent on making sure that these products are what they say they are, that they're done the right way, and making sure that there's no risk for the patient, making sure things are, one of the things we didn't talk about in that conversation is sterility, which is a huge, huge thing, especially if you're injecting a lot of these products. And so you want to make sure that products are what they are, that they're sterile, and that they're used in the correct manner. And so all of these things are unfortunately expensive, but as these become more popular and are produced in larger scale, these prices will absolutely go down.
Okay, great. That's always nice to hear.
Yeah.
And new ones will come out.
Exactly. New ones will come out, which are better. And this is obviously a good thing. Because, the science is always getting better, meaning that we're going to have better therapies to treat a lot of different and unique patients.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're enjoying this show, please be sure to share you with your friends and rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. And check out our other shows as well. We talk about everything. You should know that we also do have a local practice in Seattle, Washington, where we see patients and we prescribe all of these peptides, both IV, transdermal, subcutaneous, and oral. You're welcome to come see us there or schedule for an online consult. You can get all the details about our clinic and the services we offer through our website, centerforhealingneurology.com. Getting on our newsletter list, which you can do from the website or by calling the clinic, is one way to stay current with all of the classes, education, new podcasts, and services that we're offering. Please also do check out Ryan Smith's website at tailormadecompounding.com. Tailor is Tailor. They also have lots of great information about peptides. We'd also like to say a word from our sponsor. Not Your Standard Cider, the Seattle Cider Company, bridges the gap between wine and beer with flavorful, small batch cider, bringing true craft cider back to Seattle and across the country. Seattle Cider Company's year-round and seasonal offerings break the mold of overly sweet cider, showcasing the incomparable flavor of Washington apples. Naturally gluten-free and made from a custom blend of fresh-pressed, locally grown apples, Seattle Cider Company's products are handcrafted with all natural ingredients and never from concentrate. Seattle Cider Company products are currently available throughout Washington, Oregon, Alaska, Idaho, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nevada, Missouri, Massachusetts, Colorado, North Carolina, South Carolina, Montana, and Pennsylvania. Visit our tasting room, The Woods, at 4660 Ohio Avenue South in Seattle. And for more information, visit Seattle Cider Company or follow Seattle Cider Company on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Seattle Cider Co. Now back to our show. In this second half, we really dive into individual peptides that we can use to further our health.
So when you and I originally talked, I was trying to kind of wrap my mind around peptides and whether there were ways that you could kind of categorize them or think of them. And the analogy that I ended up envisioning was just like a big ball pit. So they're all kind of just thrown in there. But I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the different ways that they actually impact our cells, like signaling by enzymes, by carrier.
Yeah. The number one way that I like to talk about peptides is cellular signalers. And so this means that they're always around in the blood and carried to particular tissues where there's a receptor on the outside of the cell which they can activate. And this causes a lot of downstream results in the cell. And so this is the majority of how almost all these peptides are going to work. However, there are a lot of peptides which might penetrate the cell, or might have, something where they can go in and help increase DNA expression, or they might decrease, enzyme expression, or, there are a lot of different mechanisms by which this happens. But again, they're usually carried all around the body by, and acting on, there are three sort of signaling ways: autocrine, which is, relatively localized; paracrine, which is, sort of localized; and the endocrine, which is sort of body wide. And I like to talk to peptides about that, because a lot of peptides are secreted by the body naturally, just to affect the cells around the area. And we can take advantage of that type of signaling for different things. And so there are a ton of different classes of peptides, from everything that, might go through the blood-brain barrier, as we talk a lot about the neurology component of it, or there might be things that, don't travel much at all and produced, in a cell and meant to stay in a cell. And so there are a lot of things to take advantage of in different classes. But I think one of the best ways to think about the peptides is from sort of a functional approach, where you talk about organ systems, because a lot of these peptides are meant for specific tissues, and their ability to affect certain tissues is regulated by the expression of receptors on those tissues in a specific manner.
Our practice really is the whole gamut of the healing neurology. So this goes everywhere from complex chronic disease and ALS and neuropathies, a lot of autoimmune disease, a lot of really devastating autoimmune disease, all the way down to optimizing health and performance, athletic performance and cosmetics, and kind of the beauty side of being alive, because all of this heals our neurology. So if we just pick some of the kind of beads along that chain, to use a peptide analogy, starting with kind of chronic complex disease, and especially neurological disease, what are some of the neurological peptides that you like best?
Yeah, we have a lot. One of my favorites, just due to its breadth, is the Cerebrolysin. The Cerebrolysin is actually a lot of different peptides purified from actually porcine brain tissue, but it's got more double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trials than I have even counted. I think this usually have all of the literature on all of these, except for the Cerebrolysin, because it's so copious. But usually it's been used for stroke treatment or TBI treatment, but has data in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and neuropathy, in a lot of different things. And due to how many things it can actually affect, I think it's one of the best peptides for neurological treatment and improvement. And so that one is one that I always highly recommend for people, and can make a huge difference in people's lives. It's also one of the very few which is done IV as well as subcutaneously, which makes it a popular treatment protocol. But again, that one is always one that's very, very exciting. In addition to that, we've talked about the Selank and the Semax. Those are ones that are more continuously administered, but still have a really great effect. And like I said, a lot of literature coming out of Russia. So those two are also very exciting for learning and anti-anxiety, as well as a lot of those other additional effects I mentioned. And then we even have some newer ones like the Dihexa or the FGLL. The Dihexa is, again, fits that same narrative we talked about earlier, where they saw all the benefits of the body's natural angiotensin 4, and then they said, hey, how can we make sure that we get some of these reparative nootropic effects, in a different fashion? So they made a product which mimicked angiotensin 4, and that was the Dihexa. And the Dihexa has been shown to be amazing in things like Parkinson's, and a variety of neurological repair. And then lastly, one of my favorites, a very, very new product, is the FGLL, or the FG loop peptide, which really is exciting for Alzheimer's, has some really good research in Alzheimer's, stroke, or depression, but was awarded $60 million in 2016 for additional research because it looks so promising. We use a lot of it, not just for things like Alzheimer's or degenerative diseases, but also for just optimal functioning. As you mentioned, that's obviously a huge target as well. And some of the memory benefits that it can have been pretty impressive in our patient population.
A lot of the patients, by the time they get to us, we've been thinking about how to kind of turn this like post-infectious neurodegeneration or this autoimmune neurodegeneration that we see, what would most target that level? One of the ways that we think about, say, Lyme disease is that sometimes it's the Lyme is the organism that's actually doing the active kind of bad deed, but sometimes if force of the body has been napalmed and now the Lyme isn't there anymore, like the Lyme has been killed off or the Lyme is hiding or the Lyme is kind of in remission, but the napalm is what's been so impactful to the system. And so just putting antibiotics into a system that's been napalmed is not really growing back the forest. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's something we see a lot of. And there are a couple ways I would say that our physicians use peptides to go about treating that. One of the biggest ways is using a product called Thymosin Alpha-1. The Thymosin Alpha-1 is an FDA-approved product for malignant melanoma, hepatitis C, and hepatitis B. And it works via immune regulation. And one of the biggest things, as you talk about this napalm, it's really uncontrolled inflammation and these negative processes, which can cause inflammation of things like the microglial cells in the brain, which cause that brain fog. And so if you can really use the immune system to tamper down that inflammation, but also increase, all the good types of the immune system, which can help fight any type of Lyme, which might be in remission or hidden within those cells. One of the biggest problems with Lyme is it's intracellular. And so finding these cells and finding the Lyme inside these cells is difficult for the body to do. But one of the ways you can do that is by increasing something called MHC class 1 expression, which helps the immune system find these abnormal cells and then get them out of the body. And so with the Thymosin Alpha-1, you're doing both. You're finding these cells which are infected and getting rid of them, which is why it's been approved for hepatitis C and hepatitis B, which is why people like to use it if they're to increase the efficacy of vaccines, which is why people use it for flu and influenza. But at the same time, you're also reducing the abnormal inflammation process, which can lead to some of those negative side effects. And so that's a really, really popular one. And I would say those patients. Another one that I can recommend is called the ARA-290. The ARA-290 is one that mimics a product in your body called erythropoietin. And people might be familiar with that product because a lot of, bicyclers, dopers use it because it can actually have some effects on red blood cell synthesis, which allows more oxygen to be carried around in the system. But one thing that many people don't know is that erythropoietin is also secreted by tissues, not just by the bones and for systemic administration. So it can have an effect at the tissue level to have an anti-inflammatory response. And it works via a receptor, which is really aptly named, called the innate repair receptor. And the innate repair receptor can really reduce inflammation, particularly, though, in nerve tissue. So these microglial cells, these nerve cells, and which is why it's been so good for things like neuropathic pain, peripheral neuropathies, and then even autoimmune conditions, which have some of that prolific inflammation that's sort of occurring all over the body. And so that's another one I would say that's pretty popular in those patients and growing in popularity.
You've just hit on kind of all the different mechanisms. When we talk about neurodegeneration, it really is a combination of the neuroendocrine, immune, psychotherapy we haven't talked about. And I want to ask you actually next about ADHD. What are your thoughts about ADHD peptides?
Sure. So ADHD peptides were a little bit limited, I would say, at the moment. And I think a part of that is because there hasn't been a lot of research done. Usually ADHD is most highly diagnosed in children. And that as a patient population is probably the last to commit research to because you want to do no harm first, right? So you always want to make sure that it's safe and effective in adults and then move to the pediatric population. So I think that you'll definitely start to see some improvements in ADHD treatment that go beyond some of those dopamine reuptake inhibitors that are most classically used. The one product, the peptide product that's frequently used is the Cemax. We already talked about its ability to help with focus and learning and behavior. And it does have some studies in children for ADHD. And so right now that is probably the only product that is frequently used from the peptide realm.
Right. And to take that question line a little further, how do we feel about peptides in kids?
We absolutely always urge caution in this area and not to do it unless it has, a lot of clinical data. And a lot of these peptides do. Things like the Thymosin Alpha-1 have great pediatric studies. Things like the Cerebrolysin have great pediatric studies. And then the Selank and the Semax also have some pediatric dosing. And so with all that being said, it is we always recommend reading the literature, but there are definitely some great applications of these things in children, and not just with those neurological peptides, but with a lot of the other peptides as well.
Let's talk a little bit about NAD.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
What is it? How does it work?
Yeah. So NAD is, a product which has been very, very popular lately because of all the things that it helps do in the body. It helps with immune functioning, with, CD38. It helps with, PARPs and sirtuins being one of the really big enzymes which deacetylate the DNA and change DNA expression, which is highly implicated in aging. And so one of the biggest things we see as we get older is that NAD levels decline. And so for anyone who's thinking about optimizing function as they age, NAD has been, I would say, a product which is definitely in that conversation for treatment. And a lot of the things that it does in the cell, it sort of powers processes which are very, very important. So it's used as a reagent for a lot of chemical processes. And so the thought around NAD has been, if you can, replace some of this NAD that decreases as you age, you might allow the body to function in a more appropriate fashion, in a more optimized fashion. So the NAD is synthesized in your cells from nicotinamide to nicotinamide mononucleotide, or the NMN, which is very, very common, then to the NAD. And so it's all a very, very important process, which again powers a lot of really important enzymes and processes in the body.
This brings up an interesting point, because what we started talking about was peptides are really so specific and targeted, but our body really does use an iterative way of processing things, so that at many different levels, it uses similar enzymatic processes. So even though these are specific and targeted, they can be specific and targeted. It's not like for a finger or a toe. It's specific and targeted for an enzymatic process, which is repetitively used in many systems of the body.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's always exceptions to the rule, right? Just because the body is so diverse and it's made to have so many different processes, so that your body can regulate, every outcome. So that if your body senses any type of, deficiency, your body can maintain control and shift. And a lot of times your body just needs a little bit of help in that process, which is what the peptides are really meant to do.
Autism, any thoughts about autism?
So it's not something we do a lot of, again, just because of the research, in children. There are, I would say, a lot of peptides that are highly correlated to autism and autism treatment. One of those is gastrin-releasing peptide, which is not something that we do, but has a lot of good research. And I know that some physicians are using things which can help regulate the immune system a little bit, like the Thymosin Alpha-1 for autism. But not being an area of my expertise, it's harder for me to speculate.
Okay. So let's move down the spectrum a little bit and talk a little bit about recovery. So that's kind of for ameliorating really deep, chronic, complex disease. What about recovery? What are some good recovery peptides?
Well, I already mentioned one, the ARA290, which again can reduce inflammation and help and repair specifically of nerves. But beyond that, we have, I would say, a plethora of repair and recovery peptides. Two of the most popular ones are the thymosin beta-4 and the BPC-157. The thymosin beta-4 is an endogenous peptide, which is one of the first things that's upregulated when you get an injury. So if you get a cut in your skin, it's one of the first things produced in that wound bed. What it can do is help bring blood flow to the area, to help bring all the natural signaling molecules to the area to help repair and recover. It also helps build the cytoskeleton of that area. And so this is one that's been used in sports doping for a long, long time because of its ability to help repair and recover soft tissue. And so that is one that I would say can help with any type of soft tissue injury. It's been used for myocardial infarction, from everything from that to helping repair organ systems, to help even regrow hair. So it's a really interesting product. And then the BPC-157 has, I would say, another great repair and recovery effect at reducing inflammation. Its mechanisms of action are very diverse, but it's one of the things that almost everyone sees a benefit from using it for repair and recovery. And so I would say that those are definitely probably our top two, but we also do small molecules like the pentasam polysulfate, which can help with things like osteoarthritis, things that are pretty hard to treat. And so there, again, peptides for repair and recovery are one of the biggest areas and one of the, I would say, the most popular areas of treatment.
Absolutely. And here we'll actually inject into the site of dysfunction. So for instance, we had a patient with back pain a couple of weeks ago who was already on BPC 157 subcutaneous, kind of injecting into the fat of his abdomen. But with his back pain, we just injected it right into his back. And there's other places that we've injected specifically for that autocrine kind of action, that local action.
Absolutely. And that's, I would say a common course of treatment as well.
We move down to kind of the less urgent repair and recovery. If we're looking at optimizing general function, are there peptides for longevity?
Usually that conversation, I would say, it starts with the mitochondrial peptides, which are something we probably could have talked about at a lot of places in this conversation. But, right now, I would say there are typically most people consider 8 or 9 hallmarks of aging. And one of those is mitochondrial dysfunction. And so if you can maximize the mitochondrial production, which is what produces, most people know it as the powerhouse of the cell, right? If you can maximize the mitochondria's ability to do its job, you can do a lot of things like decreasing reactive oxygen species or free radicals. You can increase energy production, which can help keep cells alive in things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's or any type of disease where your body's abnormally causing cell death. And so there are a lot of ways that can help people. And we have a couple of really interesting mitochondrial peptides, things like the SS31, which has been highly implicated in aging, to things like the MOTS-C, which looks to have, a longevity benefit as well. And so I would say there are a lot of different applications, but the mitochondrial peptides are one of the most exciting for both longevity and performance, and even some of those, those other types of disease conditions like Lyme or fibromyalgia or some of those other chronic diseases.
Right. And fibromyalgia, often we think can have multiple sources of etiology of how those symptoms get triggered. But mitochondrial dysfunction is a very common one for for fibromyalgia, just for listeners.
Absolutely. And with that, one of the other products I mentioned before, the thymosin beta-4, also has an effect on ATP production, as well as peripheral neuropathy. And so it's one of those that is, often used, I would say, for fibromyalgia, as well as the SS31, which can, again, help with mitochondrial production and function in disease states. And so, again, a lot of application to these, which in a lot of different disease states.
That's great. And then let's talk a little bit about the cosmetic peptides, because there's a lot that actually for skin, for kind of skin shine. And in Ayurveda, the gut lining and the skin come from the same source, right? We're kind of built like a long, tall donut, right? You can stick a string through your mouth and it'll come all the way out. So it's almost like our GI tract is somewhat like outside, I'm doing air quotes, outside our body. So for our skin, if our skin is looking good, then it often means that our gut lining is healthy, and we really want to be able to shine kind of inside and out. So if we're going to go right for cosmetic or aesthetic peptides, what would those include?
Yeah, so some of, I would say, our most commonly prescribed are things like the GHK-Copper. The GHK-Copper is actually a product that is found in a lot of over-the-counter things as well, which helps stimulate collagen synthesis. It increases collagen synthesis by 70%, which is pretty incredible. Yeah, it can reduce, and that's within a month. And it can reduce fine lines and wrinkles by up to 25% within a month. And so that one's obviously very, very common for us. It can also help with repair and recovery of wounds. And so that one's very, very common. Another big area that we've seen a lot of success with are the botox-like peptides. Unlike Botox, which is using, a protein actually to inhibit and cause some paralysis of acetylcholine release, which makes sure your muscles can't contract. You can also do this topically with products like the Lufazil or the Argeline, which are able to also inhibit acetylcholine release, which can cause relaxation of muscles and get rid of a lot of those wrinkles. And so a lot of times we do, I would say, a combination of all three of those products, directly to the face for some really good cosmetic benefit. But beyond that, we even have things like the BPC, which increase collagen synthesis or help with repair and recovery after cosmetic procedures like a CO2 laser. And so the peptides for cosmetic use are limitless, and one of the biggest area of peptides. Most of the Google searches around peptides or the marketing around peptides have to do with these over-the-counter cosmetic creams and peptides. They're definitely really good resources for any skincare routine. You
make a good point that they can be used a lot in conjunction with other skin treatments as well. We know that a lot of our skin treatments, including needles in your face, is not comfortable.
Absolutely.
And so in terms of repair and recovery, a lot of these can be really helpful. Which peptides are appropriate over the counter?
Almost none. And that's an important thing, is that a majority of these things are going to have INDs, or investigational new drug applications, which means that they're entirely regulated as drugs. And it goes to basically say that, again, if you're not getting these through a pharmacy, it can be sort of unlawful, as well as a little bit worrisome from a treatment strategy point. So if it's a cosmetic cream, almost all the times it's going to be legal and appropriate.
Okay. So one last question is, like, what do peptides mean to you in your life? Like, what have they given you?
So much. I think that, they open up a whole new strategy of treatment, which allows for a really, really selective approach. And as we start to think about the way that medicine is sort of treated in this country, where, it's really a treatment for a particular diagnosis, the peptides open up a world of preventative medicine, which I think will get people really, really excited, because we can reduce the incidence of disease. It's fun. It makes medicine, not just a treatment strategy, but a lifestyle. And I think that's very, very exciting.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening today with Ryan Smith from tailormadecompounding.com. We've got lots of ways to continue this conversation through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also get more information from and about us at our website, Center for Healing Neurology, or even better, come see us in person at our Seattle-based clinic, or call to set up a video appointment. Please be sure to share this show with your friends, and we welcome your rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Feel free to send topic requests to podcast@centerforhealingneurology.com. We love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. We rise or fall together, and we are committed to doing what we can to make as many of us as healthy as possible. And this takes all of us, including you. Thank you for listening. See you next time.
Partyfish Media acknowledges that it operates and records on indigenous Duwamish and Puget Sound Coast Salish land that is still home to the Duwamish tribe. This land is stolen in violation of the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and community members from these nations who reside alongside us. For more information on this land, its people, or ways you can help, visit duwamishtribe.org or realrentduwamish.org.